Welcome to the latest episode of Mob Talk Sit-Down. I'm Dave Schratweiser.
And I'm George Anastasia.
George, one of the more public mob hits in Philadelphia history, right here on Spruce Street 17 years ago, Raymond Long John Martorano.
Yeah, one of the murders that hasn't been solved and is still on the plate of the FBI.
All right, George, Martorano shot right here on Spruce Street. Shot outside his home, actually, driving his car. Tries to get himself to the hospital. Doesn't make it. Car crashes into a fire hydrant here 17 years ago. Happens in January. He passes away in February.
Yeah, it was kind of an amazing story when you think about it. And this guy was a player all the way back to the Angelo Bruno era. Had spent a lot of time in jail for the John McCullough murder. That murder conviction was overturned. He's released, and he's in his 70s, and he's got a pacemaker. And apparently,
on his way to the doctor that morning.
Yeah, and apparently he wanted to get back into the life, even though you could argue there was really no need to. And that's the reason he was hit. Nobody's ever been charged. And as I said, it's one of those cases that the FBI is certainly looking at. It ties back into the Joe Legambi organization, who was in charge back then, what the motivation was. All those kind of things are certainly in play.
Nobody's ever been charged, by the way.
Nobody's been charged, and it's one of 2 or 3 murders that we always make reference to that are still of interest to the FBI in trying to put together another racketeering case.
The public nature of that, I mean, he pulls out his back driveway, comes down the block, 1 or 2 gunmen open fire on him. There's some suspicion that a third person might have also been on the scene right there. The car crashes right here along Spruce Street, blood all over the front seat. The crime scene shows up. There's these big long probes through the bullet holes into the windshield. Obviously a public display. Yeah,
I mean, and it harkened back, this is 2002 that it happened. It harkened back to the Scarfo era.
The 80s.
When that kind of thing was typical of the mob. I mean, it's one of those things where we did it right out in public. What are you going to do about it? That was Scarfo's approach. And this was kind of similar to that. And in a lot of ways, I think it set a tone and set the FBI again onto what are these guys about. This kind of violence has got to stop. You can't have this kind of Wild West kind of shooting. That was a typical Wild West kind of shooting
that
like
we hadn't seen for a while. Like 4 o'clock rush hour here in Society Hill area, right in this section right here, going into Center City.
Well, and the amazing thing was that Martorano drove about 4 or 5 blocks.
Yeah.
And crashed here, kind of on his way to the doctor's office. Now he's on his way with 4 or 5 bullets in him.
Yeah. And quite a scene with the crime scene guys out here that day. I mean, they were all over that car. A lot of speculation here on the street what it was. We weren't really sure who it was right off the bat. Then all of a sudden it's a mob hit. And it's one of those things, like you say, that constantly gets brought up as one of the things we could go after if you're the FBI.
Yeah, and the interesting kind of one of the backstories in all of this is Long John Martorano's back out on the streets because his conviction for the murder of John McCullough was overturned.
Right.
Joe Legambi, the mob boss, was back out on the street because his conviction in the murder of Frankie Flowers was overturned. Martorano was linked to another murder, the murder of Stevie Boris back in the 70s. Martorano supposedly set that up. That case, you could argue, was botched by the DA's office. They arrested the wrong guy, Neil Ferber, who was on death row.
Right.
That case Ferber's case was overturned, and the DA never pursued who was involved in the Boris shooting after that because of probably to save face, because they didn't want to admit they were wrong in the Ferber case. So you've got 3 different murders overturned that kind of set in motion what happened here.
Talk about this. This is, of all the mob murders that are unsolved, this is going to be a tough one to solve. There were no witnesses. To my knowledge, there's no surveillance video that was available. Really, nobody saw what happened. They're surmising what happened.
Yeah, I mean, God knows. I mean, it happened in the afternoon. There were speculation 2 or 3 people involved. Some names surfaced early on, but never amounted to anything. And I think that when you talk about a cold case, this is definitely a cold case. And of all the unsolved mob murders that we've talked about, I think this is probably the one that's least likely to get solved unless somebody who was directly involved.
What do you need to solve this in your mind?
Somebody who was directly involved decides they're jammed up on something else and they're going to give it up. I think that's the only way this case gets solved.
All right, speaking of the Martoranos, some more news. George Cowboy Martorano, who's been out of prison since 2015 after doing more than 30 years on a drug case, probably one of the worst drug sentences ever handed out in this country. Gets released from prison. He's got a new venture.
The Hip Hemp Cafe. Yeah, you got to give the guy credit. He's an entrepreneur.
Absolutely.
Spent 32 years in jail, and during that time built up a prison record that I think was exemplary. and kind of remade himself.
Wrote books,
plays, canceled prisoners,
yeah.
And that's one of the reasons he was released after 32 years. And now he's got this hip hemp cafe, which it takes extract from hemp.
Yeah.
CBD it's called, and you know it's in drinks, it's in lollipops.
You're pretty hip,
it's in
George. That
muffins.
was good. CBD.
Well, and it's supposedly it's anti-anxiety and also for aches and pains. We'll see where it goes. I mean, he's very entrepreneurial. You got to wish him luck in terms of that. He certainly did his time, and he was convicted as a kingpin. Yeah. And spent 32 years in jail. Some interesting videos on YouTube of him speaking in public about his life in prison, what happened to him, all those kind of things. Quite the good speaker too. I mean, he really does a nice job. Yeah, he presents himself very well. He's an example, I think, one example of somebody who's come back and tried to remake himself. And ironically, I mean, this is happening at the same time that another guy who was going to remake himself, Phil Narducci, ends up back in jail in that extortion case we talked about last time. Yeah. You know, these guys, some of these guys, I guess, just can't get away from the life. All right, nice segue into Narducci. Some court documents released this week. The affidavits for probable cause and the search warrants at Narducci's home and his business, and some other search warrant documents, some returns. Let's talk about the affidavit. There's some interesting stuff in there right off the bat that you can't kind of get away from here. Yeah, I mean, this is the FBI agent who applied for the search warrant, and it kind of details what they were looking at and what happened. And one of the interesting things from my perspective reading it is that the confidential witness, who's not been identified, we think we know who he is, but the confidential witness was working with the FBI, I think, from 2001 to 2006 on some national security issues. And got paid. And got paid about $1,000 bucks, not a lot of money, but it looks as if, I mean, and this kind of goes to what we've been told, is this is somebody probably of a Mideastern extraction who relocated here and was running a business here. Granted some immigration status by the government for helping out. Exactly. That's the other thing the affidavit indicates, that he is here in part because his immigration was smooth because of his cooperation. Yeah. Now that's 2001 to 2006. Now we're, what, 6, 7, 10 years later, and now he's jammed up apparently in some debt obligations to Narducci and goes back to the FBI and says, I got a problem, and he wires up. And apparently it's the same guy who's involved in another situation with borrowing money and extortion with another guy who's also in prison, charged at the same time but in a separate case. And the FBI quick to point out that they didn't direct him to borrow money like that, and they admonished him for borrowing money from that individual. I think they've got to say that, and they don't want this to look like it was a setup. This is a guy, we've talked about this last time. This witness is crucial to the charges against Narducci. Yes. And it's his word against Narducci's word. Right, given his background, no tape. Given all that he's been involved in, given the deals that he's gotten from the FBI in the past, the federal government in the past, you got to wonder how well he's going to hold up when he gets on the stand. Yeah. The case, there's a lot of good tapes in this case, but they go to Mr. Gallo rather than Mr. Narducci. So in Narducci's case, I think it's going to be almost a one-on-one kind of thing. However, in the affidavit, there's mention of one incident where Narducci threatens this witness in, I guess, a back room of his restaurant, and there's someone else there. Yeah. Who may be able, CW2. Right. Cooperating witness number 2. He may be able to corroborate at least something of what the first witness will say, and that's always effective in terms of prosecution. This case got a long way to go. It's pretty straightforward, but there's always the credibility issue when you come to a witness like this. All right, no tapes, but some text messages, allegedly from Narducci to this guy, and some stuff on there about, you made a fool of me, you've been lying to me, you disrespected my wife, stuff like that, in texts, but not on tape. Gallo, James Gallo, who allegedly threatened him or talked about threats and talked about Narducci and murders and things like that, he's all over the tapes. Yeah. He looks like he's going to have a tough road to hoe coming down when this goes to trial. I think so. In the case against Gallo, it's his word on tape and the things he's saying. In terms of the text, I mean, I think you can interpret them a lot of different ways. One of the things in this affidavit that we read is that supposedly Narducci was trying to force this victim to sign a document indicating it was a loan. And Notary Public there, right. I think. Yeah, so that, I mean, that's where the allegation was, that he threatened him and threw him across the room and eventually threw him into the windshield of a car. Those kind of things go to the government's case. The text, however, could play in Narducci's favor depending on how you want to interpret them. Yeah, now I spoke to Brian McMonigal. He's Philip Narducci's attorney. He tells me they're going to fight this case. They've asked for a trial date in April. They want a speedy trial in the situation, and it sounds like they're ready to fight. I mean, Brian's very good. Brian's a fighter. Brian will take the evidence as it exists and work with it. I've seen him do wonders in the courtroom. He's very good on his feet. And again, I think the tapes are going to hurt Gallo. The tapes not necessarily going to hurt Narducci.
But do they sit together at trial? Could it splash onto Narducci there?
Well, I mean,
it's the same case. It's a conspiracy, allegedly. He's talking about Narducci. It's about collecting debts, allegedly, for Narducci. So they kind of got to sit together.
And well, that's if they do sit together, then you get a situation where is Narducci's defense going to be Gallo's talking, but it's not me. He was using my name. I wasn't involved. I mean, that's a difficult position to take if you're both at the same defense table. I think if you look at the way these things play out, maybe you see a guilty plea by Gallo before it happens. Maybe the case gets severed. A lot of different things can happen. April, I'm going to be amazed if it goes that quickly.
Some of the mob guys on the street have told me they think this case is going to be superseded, and they wouldn't be shocked if a trial date got set and it got superseded right before, and that pushes the thing off some more.
Well, if you remember, I think we heard at the bail hearings that the government's alleging that Narducci had as much as $300,000 out on the street.
Yes, he did.
Well, we're only seeing we're seeing 115 here. So where's the other? What is it? 185,000.
Yeah,
it's somewhere.
Okay. All right. So the Narducci case moving along through the courts, George. April trial date. Do we get that?
A lot can happen between now and then. We'll have to see.
All right. See you next time.